All right, everyone, welcome. And thank you as always for those awkward couple of seconds when I have to get the YouTube live set up as well. So welcome everybody. We are on, if you can believe it, week 4 of our beer judge training. And tonight we're going to be continuing with beer styles. So we're going to be talking about the styles within the Pale Malty European Lager category, Pale Bitter European Lager, and we'll finish up with a little bit of a change of pace and talk about German wheat beers. So as always, as you have questions, please put them in the Q&A. And as we're going through, I'll make sure to pause and answer any questions that have come in. And with that, we will go ahead and jump right in. And I will get all of this set up. I hope if you are on your last day of a 3-day weekend that it was a good one for you. Mine involved too much drinking, so I'm having kombucha tonight rather than any beer. But I hope you all have something in front of you as well. And let me... All right, so again, this week we are talking about the 3 categories: Pale Malty European Lager, Pale Bitter European Lager, and German wheat beer. So of course, definitely feel free to, talk in the chat, and then any questions, pop them in there. If you have read through these and you have questions, if you've gone through some of the past week's material, anything that you have a question about, please feel free to put that in the Q&A so we can get it answered today. So tonight, we'll be talking about the, within the Pale Malty European category, European Lager category, we're going to be talking about Munich Helles, Festbier, and Hellesbock. Hellesbock is also known as Maibach. In the Pale Bitter European Lager category, we're going to be talking about German Leichtbier, Kolsch, German Helles Export Beer, German Pils. And then we'll wrap up with German wheat beer. We'll talk about Weissbier, Dunkel Weissbier, and Weizenbock. So you all are familiar by now with the with our BJCP score sheets. If you do have a beer tonight, hopefully you've got a score sheet that you can fill it out as we go along and as you are, perceiving your beer. But as always, the reminder, if you're going to judge at a competition, the competition score sheet is going to be the one more than likely that you'll be using. If you're going into the exam score sheet is what you will see instead. So I always like to continue to remind everybody of that, just to help, if you go into your BJCP beer judging exam and you've got a different exam score sheet, you're already expecting that. It doesn't kind of throw you for a loop. I know the first time I took a beer judging exam, I didn't know that there was a different score sheet. So it kind of I was a little surprised when I saw that. So anyway, this will just stay at the beginning of each presentation each week to remind you that there is a difference between the two. So when we're talking about Pale Malty European Lager, all of the beers within this category are going to have these common characteristics. They're going to be malty, so there'll be a malt forward beer, pale in color, hence the name Pale Malty European Lager category. It's going to be Pilsner malt driven. So specifically German Pilsner malt. So you can have American Pilsner malt, you can have Belgian Pils, you can have German Pils. This is Pilsner malt driven German beers. And so we have a couple of new vocabulary words this week that you will see here. They are going to be beers of Vollbier and Starkbier strength. So Vollbier, Voll is going to be full or entire. So all beers with an original gravity of about 1044 to 1047, or particularly in Europe and with most professional brewers as well, they actually measure gravity in degrees Plato. So a Voll beer is going to be anything with an OG of 11 to 14 degrees Plato. Stark beer, Stark is going to be strong. All beers with an original gravity of more than 1065 or 16 degrees Plato. So we don't really, particularly in the United States, you don't see a lot of beers broken down by strength. We tend to categorize them more so based on their flavor, based on their color. So this is a good reminder that guidelines, beer style guidelines, are just that. They're just guidelines. They're decided by a group of people. They're fluid. They change over time. And these are the guidelines dominantly used in the United States. So you may see something like Volbeer or Stark beer. Just be aware that those are different designations that are used in other countries. And in the United States, we've given them a different kind of designation. But I like to include this here because I know that I understand sort of if I saw like Volbeer, I have an idea of what it is because I've read about it. But I wanted to make sure to include what it actually is in here for myself as well as for all of you, that those are designations that are used in other countries besides the United States. So full beer, Stark beer. Luckily, I don't have to say that much more tonight, I don't think. But these are all going to be pale. They're going to be Pilsner malt driven. They're going to be very malt forward. They're well attenuated. They're all going to be lagers. So they did a really great job with naming this category. And I do like to point that out because myself, I know I can get stuck within the styles and forget that these are categorized by common traits. So just remember that, something like Pale Malty, all of the beers we're going to be talking about in this category are going to be pale in color and they're going to be malt forward. So the first one we'll start with is Munich Helles. And I actually have a poll here to share with you all. And I think last week I saw a couple of people say that they really liked being able to do the polls. So before we kick off with Munich Helles, let me ask all of you, what does Helles mean in German? And I will let you all answer that. So that is our first question that we'll have tonight. But when we're talking about a Munich Helles, our overall impression is going to be a clean, malty, golden colored German lager with a smooth, grainy, sweet malty flavor and a soft, dry finish. Again, we're not going to get too in the weeds on the stats. Just know that it's a mid ABV beer. A Helles is something specifically within Munich, but it's one of those beers that's designed to be enjoyed in quantity. So this is what you see in the boots, in the Mosskrugs at places like Oktoberfest. A lot of times that will be a Munich Helles, and they're designed to be refreshing. They're designed to be drunk in quantity, so that ABV, that's usually how I can remember, is the ABV is going to be about middle of the road, because you're supposed to be able to drink it all day. And all right, so it looks like almost everybody has voted on here. So what does Helles mean in German? Helles means pale, so it might be pale, fair, but generally when you see hell in German is going to be light, pale, fair, something like that. So Munich Helles means it's a light colored beer from Munich. Okay. So then we also have the commercial examples there for you as a reminder. These commercial examples aren't all of the commercial examples written in the BJCP guidelines, but they are the ones that, when you're wanting to know what a Munich Helles should taste like, you can start with the commercial examples listed here, listed in the BJCP guidelines. Those are going to be the best representations of the style, so you can get a better idea. Again, there's no beer style police, so I could brew a stout and call it a Munich Helles. It would be very confusing. It would probably be a poor business decision, but I could do it. So when you're looking to learn styles, I always suggest starting with these commercial classic examples as listed by the BJCP, because they're going to give you the most accurate representation of what that style should taste like. So when we're talking about describing a Munich Helles, again, thinking back, our larger umbrella is going to be pale, it's going to be malt forward. So with the malt, we're going to have moderate malt, is going to be grainy sweet because it's going to be that German Pils malt. So thinking back 2 weeks ago when we were talking about beer flavor and sources of flavor, you might remember with the base malt, the palest malt you're going to have is going to be Pilsner malt. So that means that that malt has been kilned just enough to, to remove the amount of moisture that needs to be removed and add just a very slight bit of some sort of a browning flavor from the kiln. But it's really kilned just enough to get to that kind of like shelf stable space. And with one of the things I really love about doing a hot steep with Pilsner malts, particularly Pilsner malts from, from Germany, from Belgium, from the United States, is that it really tastes the closest to what that terroir is. It tastes the closest to what the barley tastes like. So with something like a Pilsner malt, you're going to get that very grainy flavor. You can also pick up hay, honeysuckle, clover. There are a lot of really delicate flavors that will come through when you're using a Pilsner malt. So with a Munich Helles, with the German Pilsner malt, we would expect that grainy sweetness. Again, since we're using Pilsner malt, background note of DMS is not going to be a fault. So briefly with DMS, I know we discussed it last week as well. There are a lot of really great resources out there who can go into far more detail and explain it far more concisely than I. But with something like Pilsner malt, you'll have this precursor to DMS is SMM, and that lives in the barley that makes it through the malting process, but it's very heat volatile. So in a kiln, as the heat goes up, you're driving off more of that SMM, that precursor to DMS. So when you're not kilning malt for a very long time, you retain a lot of that doesn't get driven off. So what that means is during the boil, it can even happen during a vigorous fermentation, that SMM is going to get converted to DMS. So with Pilsner malt specifically, DMS is a problem, or can potentially add as a flavor to the beer. So that's also why, again, if you make the rules, you get to break the rules with beers that are very Pilsner malt forward. That background DMS level is not necessarily a fault. Again, if you're smelling a beer and you're wondering is this too much DMS, it probably is. But just sometimes you'll just be able to get a little bit of a snatch from that with something like a Pilsner malt. So again, we're looking at malt forward beers, so we're not going to be expecting a ton in the way of hops. Our hop flavor or hop aroma is going to be low to moderately low, and we're going to get spicy, floral, herbal flavors. You will see that spicy, floral, herbal over and over and over and over again tonight because our German hops, our Czech hops, known as the noble hops, that is the predominant flavor among the different hop varieties, is going to be spicy, floral, or herbal. And I want to point that out. One, I had to type it like however many slides I had today, because every single one of these beers is going to have some sort of spicy, floral, or herbal hop flavor component to it, because that's what German hops taste like. That's what they bring to the beer. And then the other thing you're going to see with fermentation is that everything is going to have a clean fermentation profile. So when we're talking about clean fermentation profile, that's generally what you would expect from a lager. Because again, thinking back to a couple of weeks ago, a lager yeast isn't going to be producing those esters and phenol. So we're not going to be getting a lot of fruity aromas from the fermentation. We're not going to be getting a lot of spicy aromas. It's just going to be clean. And so a really great sensory, thought process to do is get something like a Sierra Nevada Pale Ale and let's say a Spaten, right? A Munich Helles, and just smelling between the two, you'll be able to see what that clean fermentation profile smells like. You'll learn what an ale, basically all ale yeast fermentations are going to have some level of esters or phenols, whereas most lager fermentations will not. So having them side by side is a really great way to demonstrate and to also train your brain to know like ale yeast, lager yeast. So all the beers we'll be talking about in the first two categories today are going to be lagers. We would expect them to have a clean fermentation profile. Appearance is going to be medium yellow to pale gold, clear. All of these beers, again, are lagers, or all of the beers in the two lager categories we're talking about, you would be expecting clear to brilliant clarity. That's part of the reason why the lagers go through that lagering process is to help clarify the beer and make it very bright and sparkling. So for all of the beers in these first two categories we'll talk about tonight, you would expect brilliant, clear to brilliant to effervescent clarity in them. And then you would have a persistent white creamy head. When we're talking about flavor, this is going to be moderate maltiness. We're going to have sweetness. Again, we'll have some of that grainy sweet malt flavor, depending on what kind of Pilsner malt you're using. You may have a range of other very delicate flavors, like I was saying, like clover, honeysuckle, hay, sometimes grassy. Again, it hasn't been kilned for very long, so it's very close to the earth that it grew out of. With hops, the bitterness, we're going to have low to medium low, again, partially because we have, this is a malt forward beer. So the bitterness is going to be there to support the sweetness, but not overwhelm it. And we've got our friends, spicy floral or herbal, low to moderately low hop flavor. With Helles specifically, one of the things you read about it a lot is that it's rounded, soft palate impression. It's soft, it's dry, and that really comes from being well attenuated, but being a very malt forward beer. You're not going to have a lot of that bitterness to, the bitterness again will be there to balance it, but the malt flavor is really what's contributing to that round and soft feel of the beer. Medium body, medium carbonation, smooth, well lagered character. And I think that these, we saw it a little bit last week in the styles that we talked about, but we're starting to get into more specifically grouped together styles. So you'll see a lot of the same language repeating, which is great because it helps you remember, helps break down all of those styles into smaller chunks. So that smooth, well lagered character is a language that we'll see again and again. So then the next beer we're going to talk about is Fest beer. And we'll probably reference Fest beer next week as well when we're talking about Märzen, which is generally when you're thinking about an Oktoberfest beer, it's going to be either a Fest beer or a Märzen that we're talking about. So a Fest beer is a smooth, clean, pale German lager with a moderately strong malty flavor and light hop character. Again, it sounds a lot like the Munich Helles because we are in the pale malty lager category. Again, something like a Fest beer is going to be designed to be enjoyed in quantity. This one's starting to get up a little bit in the ABV range, but generally, if you see a beer that's labeled as an Oktoberfest beer, it's more likely than not going to be a Fest beer. So when we're talking about Fest beer, this is going to be, as we're going through the styles tonight, the Fest beer is really going to be a little bit more than a Munich Helles in terms of flavor, but it's not going to be, it's not like an American IPA, where it's like really strong, intense flavors. So with a Fest beer, the malt is going to be, again, the star of the show because we're in the malty category. It's going to be moderate. It's going to be very rich. You're going to get more of that toasty kind of dough aromatic. You will get an impression of sweetness. And then when we're talking about something that's toasty, that's a little bit different from something that's like deeply toasted, caramel, biscuity. Those kinds of flavors we're not looking for in a Fest beer. So you shouldn't have that deeply toasted caramel or biscuity quality. A lot of times even with a Fest beer, this will have, generally mostly German Pilsner malt and maybe a little bit of a Munich malt in there to add that toasty quality to it, but it's not going to have, a caramel malt or like victory malt or anything like that in there. It's going to be a very simple recipe. So that's why it's important to understand, again, our different malts and what they do in the process, what flavors they add. So we're looking for just a little bit of toast, a little, just turning the dial a little bit more on that malt flavor. And the floral, herbal, or spicy, low to medium low, clean fermentation character. You want your Fest beer to be a deep yellow to deep golden color, bright clarity, persistent head, white to off-white head color, not head retention. So the flavor is going to be very similar to what the aroma is going to be. Medium to medium high is going to be a very malt forward beer. We'd expect a little bit of light toastiness, a little bit of bread dough quality to it, and then again, that impression of soft sweetness. Bitterness, medium low to medium. and medium low to medium floral, herbal, and spicy. Again, with the pale malty beers, the bitterness is going to be there to help round out that sweetness and support it, but it's not going to be a bitter beer. The malt is really going to be the star of the show. Clean lager fermentation characteristics, malt balance, well attenuated and crisp, but not dry. So it's going to be, again, that malt forward character is going to not have a dry mouthfeel, but it won't be the opposite of not dry isn't sweet. So hopefully that distinction makes sense, but crisp, you can have a crisp beer that is not dry. Medium body, medium carbonation. As we're starting to get up a little bit in ABV, there may be some alcohol warmth. If it's there, it should be barely noticeable. So I think we've all probably had a beer that you would describe as hot, where you get that alcohol burn. If you're getting that kind of warmth, that's too much. But if you get just a little bit, again, as we're getting up to kind of the mid 6% range, it's entirely possible that you could get a little bit of the alcohol warmth. And then, of course, our smooth, somewhat creamy texture. So then the last one we have in this category is Hellesbock. Hellesbock is also known as Maibock. This is, again, one of the, like when the BJCP came out with the guidelines in 2015, now it's called a Hellesbock. Most other places you will see it referred to as a Maibock. Just know that they're the same thing. And again, an important reminder that, you know, style guidelines are a consensus of people, and it's not necessarily like this. Again, you know, there aren't beer style guideline police. I would love to be a beer style police officer, I think, but Hellesbock, you may also see it as Maibock. So we're starting to get up a little bit more in that ABV. This is going to be relatively pale, strong, malty German lager beer with a nice attenuated finish that enhances drinkability. So again, we're starting to get like about 7.4% is going to be the high range of a Hellesbock. And there we go. So Hellesbock is also known as a Maibock because it is brewed, is a stronger strength. Bock, it's stronger strength, still drinkable beer that is brewed to be enjoyed in May. So you will a lot of times see, right now you may still be able to find some really good Maibocks or Hellesbocks out there. That's one of those really great kind of unsung heroes of seasonal beers. I think people look for, you know, wheat beers or Oktoberfest or pumpkin beers, but like don't sleep on a good Maibock in the springtime. So moderate to strong, grainy sweet malt. We're going to have that lightly toasted quality, again, lightly toasted and low Maillard products. So that's going to be, we're not going to be looking for flavors of chocolate or coffee or, you know, even like burnt toast, like not those kinds of a Maillard product, but just a low kind of toasty flavor. And also light DMS. So for all of these beers, since German Pilsner malt is the going to be the main base malt in it, that low DMS is going to be acceptable. No hops to moderately low, spicy, herbal, or floral. Clean fermentation profiles with something like a Hellesbock. As you're getting up a little bit in alcohol, you can have some low fruity esters, but it should generally be fairly clean. And then a very light alcohol note may be noticeable. Again, as we're starting to get up a little bit in ABV, that might be something that you'll be able to detect. It's going to be deep gold to light amber, bright to clear, persistent, white, large, and creamy head. So as you can see with these, you know, specifically as opposed to last week, we're talking about beers that if you lined them up, you know, it would be, you would see why they're all in the same category, but it would also be a little bit difficult to just like look at them and say, this is a Maibock, this is a Munich Helles. So the flavor is going to be very similar to the aroma. Moderate to moderately strong, grainy, sweet malt is going to be what dominates. It's going to be a malt forward beer. You are looking for some toasty notes and or Maillard products, little to no caramel flavors. Again, this is where understanding the differences between, you know, kilned and highly kilned malts versus caramel malts versus roasted malts. So when it says little to no caramel flavors, again, we're using a fairly simple grain bill. And a lot of times I think people as they're building a recipe, if they're thinking malt forward or they're thinking that it's darker, they automatically turn to a caramel malt to achieve that goal. You can achieve that color, that flavor profile with other malts. So something like a caramel malt would be inappropriate to use in a Hellesbock. Moderate bitterness, no hop flavor to, again, our friends, spicy, herbal, floral, peppery is in there this time. Clean fermentation profile. Our finish is going to be well attenuated with a moderately dry finish. Medium body, moderate to moderately high carbonation, light alcohol warmth may be present, and smooth and clean with no harshness or astringency. So as we've gone through those 3 styles, hopefully that, that's showing that, like, okay, these are why these are all related, because we just see the common themes throughout. So then next we're going to move to the bale pitter. Oh man, you guys, it's been a day. Sorry, I'm trying to look and see if I have any questions yet. I don't see any, so I'm going to take a brief pause to drink some kombucha, and then we will move into the pale bitter European lager category. So when we're talking about the pale bitter, rather than being malt forward beers, these are going to be hop forward or bitter forward beers. They're still going to have a lot of the same characteristics as the pale malty European lagers, in that they're going to be pale, they're going to be lagers, and they're going to have, again, like those kind of grassy, mostly Pilsner malt driven flavors in them. The difference is that they're going to have mild to moderately strong hoppy character. So it's still going to feature those same classic German hops. So we'll see spicy, floral, and herbal pop up throughout. This is just going to have a larger presence in these beer styles we're going to talk about. So let me get here and do this. So the first one we're going to talk about is a German Leicht beer. And Leicht beer is, you'll see a lot of, or you'll hear particularly older judges will just call it a diet Pils. And that's basically what it is. So Leicht beer meaning light beer. And this is exactly that. This is like the German version of something like a Bud Light or a Miller Lite. It's going to be pale, highly attenuated, light body German lager with lower alcohol and calories than normal strength beer. So diet Pils. And importantly, was something like a German Leicht beer, as opposed to the American light lagers we spoke about last week. A German Leicht beer is going to be 100% malt. So you won't have something like corn or rice in a German Leicht beer. It'll still be an all malt beer. So you can see very low ABV, also designed to be, low in calories. So those things are related, but 2.4 to 3.6%. So almost identical to the ABV range for an American light lager. So with the Leicht beer, we're going to expect low to medium maltiness. It's going to be grainy sweet or slight crackery. And a Leicht beer is the German answer to something like an American light lager, but it is not designed necessarily to be like devoid of all flavor or character to appeal to the masses. It really is a scaled down version of something like a German Pilsner. Low to medium hops, spicy, herbal, or floral, clean fermentation profile. This is all sounding very familiar. Straw to pale golden color, brilliant clarity, average to below average persistence with a head of retention, and it's going to have that nice white head on it. Our flavor, low to medium, grainy sweet. Again, it's going to be a very simple recipe, very simple grain bill. So you're going to pick up a lot of that Pilsner malt character. Low to medium, spicy, or herbal or floral hops, medium bitterness, again, is going to be the diet Pils. So it's a scaled down version of a Pilsner, and we'll talk about the German Pils in just a moment. But clean fermentation profile, dry finish with lightly malty and hoppy aftertaste. Very light to light bodied, medium to high carbonation, very smooth. So again, we're seeing a lot of these common themes on these beers. The next one we'll talk about is Kolsch. Kolsch is such a fun beer with a fun culture around it. And I really could talk about Kolsch forever. I won't, but I could, because it's got a lot of fun things around it. But Kolsch is a clean, crisp, delicately balanced beer, usually with a very subtle fruit and hop character. So a Kolsch is, again, one of those beer styles that's designed to be drunk in quantity. Unlike something like the Boot or the Masskrug, the big mugs that you see, like the liter mugs that you see at places like Munich during Oktoberfest, Kolsch is actually served in what's known as a Stange. And so that is I believe it's a 200 milliliter, but it's very small, very straight-sided glass. And for if you're doing like a proper Kolsch service, and you may have seen this before, where the stanges are put into what's known as a kranz. And so that's a little handled tray that has all of the stanges of Kolsch in it. And what happens if you're someplace like a Kolsch cafe is your waiter will come by. If you have an empty stange, they replace it with a new Kolsch, and they'll either make a little tick mark on you'll have a coaster that they make a tick mark on that, or sometimes they're served on coasters, and so you just stack up the coasters. And it's, you're there, you drink until you're finished, and then to pay, they just, count up those little tick marks on your coaster, or they count the number of coasters that you have. So Kolsch, again, designed to be enjoyed in a community setting for, for like a sunny afternoon kind of thing. The malts are going to be very low to low. It's going to be grainy sweet. You might have the low floral, spicy, or herbal hop aromas. Those are optional. The fermentation is what I think can be really special about a Kolsch, because it can be very clean, but you may also get this subtle fruit. There's going to be apple, cherry, pear. Sometimes a lot of Kolsch strains will have a slight winey or sulfur character to it. And that's, for me, I can usually spot a Kolsch because it has a very like sulfury Chardonnay kind of white wine aroma to it, and that's from the yeast. But generally, Kolsch is another one of those beers known as a lawnmower beer. It's for a light, fresh, crisp, refreshing beer. The appearance, very pale gold to light gold, very clear. The head may not persist, and it's going to have a very delicate head texture. The flavor is going to have, our malt is going to have grainy sweet, but you might also have a very light bread or honey note possible, depending on the kind of malt that is used. Medium low to medium bitterness, and low to moderately high floral, spicy, or herbal. The other cool thing about Kolsch is that it's one of those examples that there is quite a bit of room for interpretation within the guidelines. So it really is one of my favorite styles to judge, because you learn a lot of different ways that you can interpret making a Kolsch and it still fit within those guidelines. Fermentation is going to be very clean. Sometimes you can get that imperceptible fruitiness. You may have that slightly winey, minerally, or sulfury accent that accentuates the dryness and the flavor balance, and it's not going to be considered a fault. Your mouthfeel is going to be medium light to medium, medium to medium high carbonation, smooth, generally crisp, and well attenuated. So again, our common themes throughout all of these. So German Helles export beer, that you may also see referred to as a Dortmunder export. So again, I think most people will conventionally call it a Dortmunder, but with the 2015 BJCP guidelines, they went with German Helles export beer. So just know that those two things are interchangeable. That's going to be a pale, well-balanced, smooth German lager that is slightly stronger than the average beer, with a moderate body and a mild aromatic hop and malt character. So the German Helles export beer is one of those beer styles that, as I was writing these slides today, like I just got super excited about the possibility of going out into the wild and finding a German Helles export beer, because it is, I think it's an underdog a lot of times with beer styles, and it's really one of my very favorite ones. So it's going to be it falls kind of somewhere in between like a Munich Helles and a German Pils. So it's a little bit more than a Munich Helles, it's a little bit less than a German Pils. And we'll talk about this in a moment, but one of the things I love about a German Helles export beer is the high minerality. So in Dortmund, which is where the Dortmunder export style became popular, they have their water source has very high minerality. And so that minerality is, for me, the thing that just really makes a great German Helles export beer. So when we're talking about aroma, Again, moderate grainy sweet, like low DMS is not a fault. Low to medium hops, they're going to be floral, spicy, or herbal because they're going to be made with German hops. Those are the flavor characteristics of German hops. Clean fermentation profile, light gold to deep gold, clear, and a persistent white head. So the flavor, all of these look pretty familiar at this point, right? Like you're all going to be sick of hearing me say grainy sweet and floral, spicy, or herbal, but we're talking about German lagers, and that's just a fact of German lagers. Clean fermentation character, the balance is going to be balanced between the malt and the hops. And I just can't wait to get my hands on a German Helles export beer. Hopefully, if you see one, like grab it, taste it. I hope you enjoy it as much as I do because this style is such a great style, and I think it gets overlooked so often. Smooth, crisply refreshing, hot bitterness lingers into the aftertaste. There's that minerality character from the water. For me, that's the thing that really makes the German Helles export beer. Medium body, medium carbonation, smooth but crisp. So the next we have German Pils, and I think most of us out of all of these styles are probably the most familiar with the German Pils. And you'll remember last week we talked about Czech Pilsners, Czech Pale Pilsner, or Czech Pale Lager, Czech Premium Pale Lager, also known as Bohemian Pilsner. Tonight we're going to be talking about German Pils. This is a light body, highly attenuated, gold colored, bottom fermented, bitter German beer showing excellent head retention and an elegant floral hop aroma. So one of the things I really love about a well-made German Pils is that beautiful aroma that it has that is going to be moderate to moderately high on the hop aroma, which is going to be floral, spicy, or herbal. Floral is usually the most common, but know that it's not incorrect if the German Pils should have German hops in it. So if you have one that is maybe more herbal or spicy rather than floral, that's not a fault. It's still a German hop characteristic, but the floral is usually I guess would be the most commonly accepted hop that you would use in a German Pils. Our malt is going to be low to medium low, grainy sweet. This time you might have a little bit of light honey or slightly toasted cracker. And again, DMS is a low background note is not a fault. Clean fermentation profile, you might have a very light sulfury note that comes from the water as much as the yeast. It can be either one. But German Pils is one of those beers too that I think is always a great demonstration of a brewer's technical skill. So I've gone places before that, I've gone to like the hype breweries where they'll have all of these fruited sours and all of these adjunct stouts, and then they'll have like a German Pils on the menu, and I'll order it every time. So I'm like, okay, let's see what you've got, because they're very complex in their simplicity. It takes a lot of skill to make something that tastes so like it's still an elegant flavor. But if you just look at a recipe for German Pils, it's usually a smash beer, right? So it would usually be German Pilsner malt and some sort of like Hallertau hop. And it's amazing what you can do with just that little amount and really tease out that flavor that comes from having a lot of skill. So I always like to order a Pilsner when I can, because it's going to tell me a lot about the technical ability of the brewing team. So with the flavor, moderately low to moderate grainy sweet. Bitterness is going to be medium to high. It's going to dominate the palate and linger into the aftertaste. And our hop flavors, low to high, floral, spicy, or herbal. German Pils, kind of like Kolsch, is another one where there is a lot of room for interpretation within the guidelines. So it's really always very interesting to see what people can create that still fits within the guidelines but tastes so different from others within the same guidelines. Bitter balance, clean fermentation profile, dry to medium dry, crisp, well attenuated finish with a bitter aftertaste and light malt flavors. So again, sometimes you can have examples with a higher sulfate level. If you have that higher sulfate level, you're going to have a higher, still low, but a more of a noticeable sulfury flavor that's going to help accentuate that dryness and also lengthen the finish. Body is going to be medium light. Carbonation is going to be medium to high. So we're finished with the German lagers, and now we're going to go to something completely different and talk about German wheat beers. I'm going to check and see if we've got any questions here. without like accidentally like kicking everybody out of the meeting or something. All right, I can actually, nope. Let me see. I don't know what I did there just now. So give me one moment and I will just reshare this. All right, there we go. We're back in business. So talking about German wheat beers, again, we see our Vollbier Stark Beer Strength German wheat beers. Other important things to keep in mind, there are other German wheat beers that are in other categories. So this doesn't encompass all of them. Beers in this category are not sour. So you might have something like a Berliner Weiss or a Gosa that's going to have wheat in it, that's going to be more of a sour beer. Those are in different categories. Beers in this category can be light or dark in color. So we've got 3 beers in this category, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in depth as we go through each one. But just remember, unlike our others, you know, like pale, malty, pale, bitter, the beers in these categories can be light or dark. And I do see actually that I have a question really quickly. Is there a reason you aren't going in order for BJCP, or do I have an incorrect guideline? Emily, I'm not sure. I'm not going like category 1 all the way down. I have moved the different categories around depending on like how many styles we have per week. So that way we can kind of keep it in a within the time frame and kind of keep all of the styles together and make sure that we're doing like 10 or so per. So you don't have an incorrect guideline. We have gone from, that's a good question. We went through category 4 and 5, and now we're going to category 10. I think generally with the rest of the weeks, they will be more or less kind of, you know, front to back in order of what's in the guidelines. But yeah, we won't necessarily go like, you know, in numerical order each week. But if you have the 2015 guidelines, you have the correct guidelines. So German wheat beers. The first one we're going to talk about is Weissbier. This, you may also see Hefeweizen in the United States. A lot of times you'll see it more referred to as a Hefeweizen. So just know Weissbier, Hefeweizen, they're the exact same thing. It just depends on what people are calling it. So our overall impression for this is a pale, refreshing German wheat beer with high carbonation, dry finish, a fluffy mouthfeel, and a distinctive banana and clove yeast character. And this is for the Weissbier, for the Dunkel's Weissbier, they're going to be about, you know, mid ABV. Again, most of the beers, well, when we get to Weizenbach, that's a little bit higher in ABV. But a Weissbier is, a well-made Weissbier is just absolutely a beautiful thing. But the one thing I think most people, Weissbier seems like it has been a kind of a gateway beer for a lot of people into what, you know, what different beers can be. So I think most people are fairly familiar with Weissbier. And I know for a lot of people, that was usually their first style that they, you know, when they were getting into beer, that they knew that if they didn't want something like an adjunct macro lager, you could get a Weissbier and have that, you know, that Weissbier experience of the banana and clove yeast character. So that's with something like a Weissbier. Anytime we're talking about Weissbier, Dunkelweiss, Weizenbach, all of those, the star of the show is going to be the yeast, the Weizen yeast. And I know I've met other people before who have said, like, I made an IPA with a Weizen yeast. And you really made a Weizen beer with IPA flavors, because that Weizen yeast is what is giving you that distinct banana and clove flavor every time. So a Weizen yeast is not the same way as like using an American ale yeast. You are always going to get that banana and clove character when you're using the Weizen yeast. That's why you use the Weizen yeast. So with our malt, this is going to be mostly a wheat-based beer. So when we're talking about wheat flavors, think about something like wheat thins or malted wheat. with wheat, you also get sometimes this really nice, like lemony note to it. So for all of these Weiss beers, they are using wheat as kind of the main ingredient in the recipe. So you would be expecting those like bready, grainy wheat kinds of flavors. That's going to be low to moderate. Hops, none to low. So when we're talking about Weiss beer specifically, most German wheat beers, none of them are going to have a very high hop character. So in the aroma, in the bitterness, in the flavor, you shouldn't really be expecting a lot in the way of hops. If you're wanting to make a wheat beer that has a more like hop forward character, then something like an American wheat, like we talked about last week, would be a really good vehicle for that, because you'll still have that wheat flavor, but then you have more room to kind of play with different hops. Something like a Weiss beer, again, we want that yeast to be the star of the show. So the hops are going to be none to low. Moderate to strong phenols. So our phenols are going to be typically clove, and the fruity esters are going to be banana. So again, the banana and clove, that's the hallmark of a Weiss beer. That balance and intensity can vary, but the best examples are reasonably balanced and fairly prominent. So you should be able to taste both the banana and the clove. And this is a really great if you're at a brewery or talking to a brewer who has made a Weiss beer. It's a really good question that it had never occurred to me before, but now I ask any brewer I meet who's made a Weiss beer, like, tell me about the choices you made surrounding that banana and clove character, because there are several different Weizen strains that you can get. And there are several things you can do within your brewing process to, maybe tease out a little more clove character or tease out a little more banana character. And that is a deliberate decision that the brewer has made in making the beer. So it's always a good conversation piece to just ask, like, tell me about your Weiss beer and why you made the choice with your yeast, with your brewing process that you did. And that's also kind of, I think, as somebody who brews, there's a lot of those little decisions that happens in the background that don't always, aren't always just prominent in the finished product. And I love talking about my process and why I did the things that I did. And I think most brewers probably do. So just keep that in mind. If you ever want to strike up a conversation with a brewer, ask them about their Weiss beer and why they went for the flavor profile they did. So the other thing with fermentation with a Weiss beer, you can have light to moderate vanilla. You can also have that faint bubblegum aroma. Those are both optional, but they are acceptable. Particularly myself, I particularly like when I can get a little bit of that like light vanilla note in there, because I think it just adds a little bit more dimension to the Weiss beer. Pale straw to gold, since we're talking about a wheat beer, there's going to be a lot of wheat proteins still in suspension. So you can have a variable level of haze. Your Weiss beer, Dunkelweiss, Weizenbock, anything with a large proportion of wheat, you would not expect it to be very clear because of those wheat proteins that are still in suspension. One of the hallmarks of the Weiss beer, besides that banana and clove, is that big, long-lasting, thick, moussey white head. That's why we have the Weiss beer vases that are in part designed to be able to support and hold up that really thick, moussey, long-lasting white head for as long as possible. So that is a hallmark of a Weiss beer. So our malt flavor is going to be, again, somewhat bready, grainy wheat, slightly grainy sweet from the Pilsner malt that's in the beer, or that's in the recipe. Very low to moderately low bitterness. There's just enough to balance that malt sweetness, and none to very low hop character. So you should not be getting any hops in a Weiss beer, any hop flavor in a Weiss beer. Low to moderately strong banana and clove, very light to moderate vanilla and or faint bubblegum is optional. Other things that I know people will use in something like a Weiss beer, sometimes you might see chamomile. There are different things that brewers might put into their Weiss beer to make it a little, to add a little bit more complexity, although that's typically more of something you would see with like a wit beer. But I did actually have a Hefeweizen the other day that had chamomile added to it. And it was too much because I noticed that it was chamomile in the beer. Excuse me. So our aftertaste is going to be well-rounded, very flavorful palate with a relatively dry finish. Medium light to medium body. Our carbonation is going to be high to very high. A Weiss beer, you've got the banana and clove, you've got that big fluffy white head, you have high carbonation. Those are all hallmarks of a Weiss beer. It should always be effervescent. And then since we're using wheat, it's also going to give us that sensation of a fluffier, like fuller mouthfeel. All right, then the next one we have is Dunkel's Weiss, and I have one more polling question for you. What does Dunkel mean in German? So when we're talking about Dunkel's Weiss, this is a Weiss beer that is dark. So it's going to be, you know, the same hop profile, the same yeast profile. We're just going to be using darker malts, but we're still going to have that distinctive banana and clove yeast character. We're going to have a little bit of toasted bread or caramel malt flavor. And yes, it looks like most of you are correct. Dunkel means dark in German. So dark Weiss beer. Excellent job. All right. So with our aroma, it's going to be light to moderate, bready, doughy, or grainy. Now, since we're using darker colored malts to get that dark color and flavor, it's also going to have, often we'll have caramel, bread crust, or some sort of richer malt aroma to it. None hops, no aroma from the hops, or if it's present, very low. It's going to be lightly floral, spicy, or herbal, but you really, it should be very light because again, we want that yeast to be the star of the show. Moderate phenols, usually clove, fruity esters, usually banana. Low to moderate vanilla and or faint bubblegum is optional. So really the difference in a Dunkel's Weiss and a Weiss beer is going to be the color, also a little bit more of those darker malt flavors. But otherwise, the same kind of yeast, the yeast is going to be the star of the show. And a really well-made Dunkel's Weiss beer is going to be almost like a banana bread kind of flavor because it's going to have those darker bread flavors to it. And yeah, I just always think of it as like fresh baked banana bread. So it's going to be light copper to mahogany brown. Again, variable haze because we're talking about a wheat beer. Long lasting, very thick and moussey off-white head. So the Dunkel Weiss is going to have that same beautiful head to it that the Weiss beer does. Malt flavor is going to be low to medium high. Soft, somewhat bready wheat is going to complement the yeast. So again, the yeast is the star of the show with any beer that has a Weizen yeast in it. So everything else is not just there, but everything else is there to highlight and to complement that yeast flavor. A richer caramel toast or bread crust flavor will also be present. It should also be complementary to the yeast. Any kind of roasted malt flavor is going to be inappropriate. So something like a Dunkel's Weiss, again, the getting the color, getting the flavors, you can do that with higher kilned malts, but you don't need to go into roasted malt territory to get those colors and flavors. Hops are going to be very low to low bitterness. If you have flavor from the hops, it should be very low spicy, herbal, or floral. Low to moderately strong banana and clove. And then again, the moderate vanilla and or faint bubblegum flavor. Those are always optional. So it is important when you're looking through the styles to keep that in mind, that when it says optional, it means just that. And I say that because I've judged with people before who have said, well, it should have a vanilla character and it doesn't. I'm deducting points. No, it can be there. It's not a fault if it is there. It's not a fault if it isn't there. And then our finish and aftertaste is well-rounded and flavorful, often with a somewhat malty palate and a relatively dry finish. Medium light to medium full body, moderate to high. Again, we expect that effervescence from a Weiss beer. And then the texture of the wheat, as well as the yeast in suspension, is going to give us that fluffy, creamy fullness in the mouth. So the last one we have to talk about tonight is Weizenbock. This is going to be a strong, malty, fruity, wheat-based ale, combining the best malt and yeast flavors of a Weiss beer with the malty, rich flavor, strength, and body of a Dunkelsbock or Doppelbock. I really like Weizenbock for a lot of reasons. One of the main ones being for me that I really like rules, and German brewing has a lot of rules, and Weizenbock in particular has a lot of rules. And that's why I really respond to it. So since it's a Weizen beer, it has to use that Weizen yeast. It needs to be at least 50% malted wheat. And then since it's a Bock, according to German laws, German brewing laws, Bock, to be Bock strength, it needs to be an OG of, or original gravity of 1065 or higher. So all of those things combined, you have to meet all of those rules to be considered a Weizenbock. And I just really like having I like being a pedant about about style guidelines. So I always really like talking about Weizenbock. But yeah, what we're doing here is really combining two beer styles. So we're combining that Weiss beer, that the wheat, the yeast character, again, is going to be kind of the star of the show, and combining that with something like a Doppelbock. So a Weizenbock is another one of those beers that I don't see very often, but when I see it on a menu, I'll usually order it just because it is kind of such a rarity. And I'm not always a huge Weiss beer fan. I enjoy them when I have them, and I think that I should order them more often. But, usually if I'm looking at a menu, there's something else that I might like to try first. But a Weizenbock is always a nice reminder of what a Weizen yeast and what a wheat beer can really do. So our malt is going to be medium high to high, significant bready, grainy wheat component. And so another thing, and I know I have this noted in here as well, Weizenbock is one of those styles that it can be pale or it can be dark. So if we have a dark Weizenbock, we're also going to expect some dark fruit aromas such as plums, prunes, grapes, and or raisins. Usually with a category like Weizenbock, you can tell if somebody meant for it to be a pale Weizenbock or a dark Weizenbock. But the most appropriate thing to do as you're entering a beer, and most beer competition software will prompt you for this, but the entrant should specify if this is a pale or a dark Weizenbock. When I have a beer that's, is whether it's obvious or not, if they haven't specified, I might just put a little note in the overall impression like, hey, here's all of the rest of your feedback. Didn't deduct points, but going forward, you need to make sure that you're saying that this is a pale or a dark version of it. Weizenbock is like that. Saison is like that. I won't go down the whole rabbit hole of, again, very pedantic comments I leave on score sheets, but just so you know, an entrant should specify whether it is pale or dark. You can typically tell if they didn't specify. I also just leave a note saying, I judged this as if it was a dark Weizenbock. Anyway, hops, none. You shouldn't get any kind of hop aroma from a Weizenbock. Medium low to medium high, we want that Weizen character of banana and spice. So that spice is typically going to be clove, although sometimes you can have that light note of vanilla. If we're talking about a pale Weizenbock, we'd expect it to be light gold to light amber. If we're talking about a dark Weizenbock, we're expecting dark amber to dark ruby brown. Variable haze, no matter what, our head is going to be long lasting. It's going to be very thick and moussey. Again, it's a wheat beer. So that's going to give us that nice, thick, long lasting head. For a pale Weizenbock, that's going to be white to off white. For a dark Weizenbock, that's going to be light tan. So with our malt flavor, medium high to high malty rich flavor, again, this is where like the Doppelbock, Dunkelsbock flavors are coming into play in this beer style. It's going to have significant bready, grainy wheat flavor. Pale versions will have that bready, toasty, grainy, sweet malt richness. So we've used, we're still using like a lot of Pilsner malt, but maybe there's a little bit more Munich malt or some higher kilned malts in there. Something like a dark version will have that deeper, bready, rich, or toasted flavors with significant Maillard products. And again, those dark versions can have flavors of plums, prunes, grapes, raisins, any kind of a dark fruit flavor. No hop bitterness, no hop flavor. Low to moderate banana and spice fermentation. Again, that spice is going to be clove. Generally, it could also be a little bit of vanilla. and it typically finishes dry. So our mouthfeel is going to be medium full to full. Again, this is a higher ABV beer with a lot of malt in it and a lot of wheat in it. So it's going to have a very full mouthfeel. Moderate to high carbonation. And since we are getting up in the ABV, you might get some mild warming from that substantial alcohol content. But again, warming is not the same thing as hot. So if you get a hot beer, that is a flaw. If you get some alcohol warmth because there's a higher amount of alcohol in the beer, that's totally fine. So I think, yes, that is the end of my slides, and these will be up probably tomorrow within the next couple of days. The slides will be posted, but the notes versions of the slides, I was able to get this week's posted ahead of time this afternoon. So those are, if you want to have just the actual PowerPoint with the slide or the lines next to it to take notes, those are available. And I'll aim to have those available more than 4 hours ahead of time in the future. So let's see, we've got one more. What are your favorite techniques to help remember all of the differences in these similar beer styles? Do you think flashcards would help? Yes, Michelle, I think that is a great question. Some of this, like for me, I've just been judging for several years and have just read through the guidelines, and after a while you start to learn them. So I think that flashcards help. One of the other things that I haven't added to these slides, but that I think is super helpful, in your guidelines, they will have a style comparison section for each one. And I don't believe that that's in the app. I think the style comparison is something that is specific to the hard copy of the guidelines, but that style comparison is gold. So that will tell you something like a German Pils. It will tell you, here's how it's different from a Czech premium pale lager. Here's how it's different from an international pale lager. So those style comparisons kind of help you place everything in the larger beer universe. With flashcards, what I have found helpful, I don't use flashcards too very much anymore, but what I find helpful with them, if I've got my flashcards where I've got all the stats and, maybe like ingredients or something on there, just, flashcard stuff. One thing that I would do is go through and try to like sort them by bitterness or like ABV, and try to categorize the beers that way. To remember, like a Munich Helles is going to have less bitterness than a German Pils, which will have less bitterness than, like a Maibach. I don't think that's actually correct. So don't do that. But, going through and kind of sorting them by those and then picking them up and saying, okay, now I'm going to sort them by ABV or by color. That was really helpful for me in terms of just kind of spatially getting all of the styles together. But as you're judging, you start to learn what the differences are. And another thing, a lot of times in competitions, one thing that you'll do is talk through the style with your other judge to make sure, like, okay, we're on the same page in terms of what to expect from this style. And a lot of times that's where that would come up in terms of, Weizenbach should be pale or dark. So I would say it's a combination of experience, and then with the flashcards or however it helps you to like make spatial relationships between the different styles, I would do that. I had another friend who, for him, it was really helpful to get just graph paper and draw, like along the bottom on your x-axis, you have like Munich Helles, German Pils, German Helles Export, whatever, and then going through and actually just drawing the ranges and, and like making that graph. That visually, that was something that was helpful for him as well. But yeah, if anybody has any other tips to share in terms of that, I think that is learning. I think the bigger challenge is learning what is going to help you the most. But yeah, those techniques, it's just being in the guidelines. That's also a really great time if you're sitting at a bar or something and you order, a beer that says this is a German Pilsner. You can pull out your app and kind of read through it And that's also when I found I have the time to really like dig deep into all the different kinds of intricacies of the beer styles, which is a very important thing in almost every competition where I judge. I often have to leave feedback saying this was not entered in the correct category, or we didn't have this information, so this is what we assumed. So knowing those guidelines as a brewer when you're entering is also such an important thing to have. All right, so we are actually finished a little bit early tonight. If anybody else has any other questions, definitely pop those into the Q&A, and I'll just take a quick run through there. Oh yes, thank you, Yoshi, for the BJCP website style comparison. Yes, actually, I'm glad that you said that. One thing that I have that I had created for myself is a list of the style comparisons that I will upload. I'll make a note right now to make sure that I upload that to the resources area of the website, so that way you all can have it too. I find it's easy. It will group them together in 4 similar styles. And I think that that's a really easy way. One, if you're say doing something like practicing for a Cicerone exam and you want to practice your style discrimination, I would take that to to a bottle shop and, pick out like a German Pils, a Czech Premium Pale Lager, a Munich Helles, and an International Lager, and do like a side by side of all of them and taste through them. So let me make that note really quickly. And I will upload that so you all have it. All right, let's see, we have one more question. Oh, not a thank you, Mel, for that. All right, so with that, I will wrap it up. I will give everybody 24 minutes back in their day. And that's especially great because I think I've taken like an extra 5 minutes in all the other sessions. So I've almost repaid my time debt to all of you. And next week, I think we're doing the amber malty and amber bitter European lagers. And then I think we'll be ready to maybe head over to the UK for some of the styles after that. And very last thing, I had put this in our Discord. I will send an email out to everyone later this week, but I do have 2 BJCP beer judging exams scheduled that were approved. So we will be having one in Charlotte, North Carolina on Saturday, September 18th, and another one in Atlanta on Saturday, I think it's October 3rd. Let me double check that. The registration is open for that. If you have already sent me an email wanting to register for it, I was completely wrong. October 2nd, Saturday, October 2nd will be in Atlanta. If you've already sent me an email saying that you would like to register for one of those exams, I have it. And I am working on getting that list together and confirming. So you will be hearing from me, but if you're interested in seats on either one of those exams, just shoot me an email. It's jen@underthegenfluence.beer, and we will get you signed up for that. And we also have, I believe a few more of the exams were approved last week. So double check or check back to our event calendar later this week. I'll have those updated exam dates. So if there's one near you, you can go ahead and get registered for it. So with that, thank you everyone very much for joining. And I hope you all had a good Memorial Day. If you had a 3-day weekend, I hope you enjoyed that as well.